Hello and welcome to a More Perfect podcast. Today I have on the show with me Wes Tabor. Wes Tabor is a law enforcement expert with decades of experience across multiple agencies, including but not limited to working in state law enforcement, the DEA, working with the CIA, and working with the Special Forces. Wes wrote an amazing book called Infiltrate America Blood Roots and the Rise of Latin American Gangs, which you should totally read. I really enjoyed it myself when I read it, and actually, I wrote most of my questions that I will be discussing with Wes down while I read the book. So, without further ado, Wes, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. We've been talking about this for quite some time, and
Yeah,
we just
yeah,
happened to
we've,
meet when you bought the book,
uh
and then you
huh.
had a problem with getting a refund, and you had emailed me, and I think it was like I said, "Here's your money, and I'm giving you a free book," and I signed it and I sent it to you, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't because I was trying to like I didn't request a refund because I hated the book. I wanted the book. So I had emailed you and I was like, "Hey, I think I just bought like 4 copies. Can I get a refund for 3 of them?"
Oh, it was
You
a
know.
total glitch in the website or something where you overpaid like three times overpaid, and I felt
Yeah.
so bad. I was like, man, I didn't know you had a podcast. I didn't Google you. I didn't look at anything. I just said, you know what? Let me just make this right with this guy. You were so courteous in your email, and that's when I said, no, I'm just going to do that. And you're like, wow, thank you so much. Then when you got the book, I think you hit me up and you were like, hey, I have a podcast, and by the way, maybe you could be on it. I was like, what? And then I started looking. I was like, oh man, this guy's got a great podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, usually okay, so I'll let you in on this. Um I'll let everybody on this actually. So I look for people that have written books because usually they'll have contact information in their books. So I was already looking for somebody to interview. So like even if you had sent me your book or like even if something else had happened, I might have just pulled you anyways. But then I got a book and I read it and I was like, this guy's definitely coming on the podcast. So
That's great.
um so yeah, it worked out quite well and then we've been talking for a while. So I'll try to, for anybody who's listening, I'll try to keep it self-contained here, but just kind of, you know, I might reference something that Wes and I have talked about a while back or something like that, and it's fine. Just it'll all make sense, I promise. So, anyways, you've been in law enforcement for decades, and the first question I wanted to ask you was, what was your life like pre law enforcement? Was there some kind of formative experience that you had that made you want to go into law enforcement?
I grew up um, in the 80s. I was born in 1970, but as I became a teenager, I was in the 80s, and the 80s were really cool years. You know what I mean? You look back on social media and you see it, and you're like, wow, that had to be really cool, and it was. Van Halen, Cyndi Lauper, Ghostbusters, and then they had all the crime
Yeah,
shows, the cop shows like Chips, T.J. Hooker, Miami Vice. I mean, Miami Vice. Everyone knows what Miami Vice is, right? So
yeah.
here I am as a little kid growing up. I was in between Minnesota and Maine. My stepfather was a carpenter. He
Mm-hmm.
also was a previous felon. He had been an alcoholic at a very young age. Started robbing liquor stores, burglarizing places, you name it. He did it.
Wow.
Went to prison. He got out, stopped drinking. When he got out of prison, I believe it was 1975, 1976,
Mm-hmm.
and he stopped drinking, and he never had a legal problem again in his whole life. And so
Wow.
he's the one that really raised me. My real father was a military man, Vietnam and all those things. And he went to Vietnam and he never really came back. You know what I mean? He survived
Mm.
it, but he never really came back. So I didn't really know my real father that well. So my stepfather, the felon,
Mm.
uh, grew up without a father, kind of a lost soul. And then he took on myself and my other four siblings. and my mom, and he raised me, and so we were living in Minnesota, and I had made attempts to get into different sports. I made attempts to get into like Boy Scouts, and everywhere I went, I felt like I was getting the Heisman because I was like this poor kid. I didn't have fancy clothes, and I didn't have, my parents weren't with me a lot when I
Yeah.
went to these events and things like that. But I heard something about the Police Explorers program in 1983 in Minnesota, and a friend of mine took me. And when I showed up, the state troopers there were like, "Hey man, come on in, bro. How you doing?" Oh, shaking my hand. "Come on, you want to be a cop? Let me show you." They didn't care what my shoes looked like. They didn't care that I didn't have anyone there helping me. They didn't care
Mm-hmm.
about my background. They didn't care about anything. All they cared about is this kid has an interest in being a cop, and let's foster that idea and see if he'll become one. And I was
Mm-hmm.
hooked from the very get go. And so the trooper, in fact, the trooper that I started riding with, his name was Desmond Pepin. He died a few years back, but I remember fast forwarding 20 years, when I actually became a DEA agent, I had called him. His number was actually in the phone book. And he goes, "Man, I always thought about you, man. How are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a DEA agent, and I was a deputy sheriff, and I was this." And he was like, he's like, "Damn, you're kidding me. That's amazing. That's so wonderful. Oh, I hope, it's everything you wanted it to be." I said, "Yeah, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to ride with you and what you taught me, and you really kind of promulgated that idea in my mind to be a law enforcement officer. I can't thank you enough." He was
Mm-hmm.
like silent, kind of choked up on the phone, and he's like, "Thank you so much. It really means a lot. I'm a retired old man now." And I'm like, "Well,
Wow.
listen, it was very, very important what you did for me. Thank you." And then we didn't talk again after that. But I actually had that opportunity. So, um, and that's what hooked me and got me involved in the Police Explorers program.
Wow. Yeah, it's good that you got to talk to, your mentor. I think a lot of the times people, when they get so deep into their careers and they start achieving real success, they forget where they came from, and they don't necessarily forget where they came from, but they lose contact with those that have given with those people that opened those doors for them in the first place, and they
Right.
never think to really look for them and thank them.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, if we were to do that more, then a lot of people would feel a lot better about themselves, and they would realize how much of a difference they made in other people's lives. Because I
Yeah.
think that we forget about that a lot,
one Hundred
how
percent.
much we do make a difference. Yeah, that's really good. That's actually really good. I wasn't expecting that at all. Um, so you talked about, and this is just kind of off the cuff a little bit. And from our talks, it doesn't seem like you do, but I just have to ask: your real father, he had PTSD. It sounds like PTSD. The Vietnam War never left him. Do you have PTSD from what you did?
I think everyone that enters into this life, and I say this life, as a law enforcement officer, whether you're on a patrol, whether you're in even fish and wildlife, anything where you're carrying a gun and enforcing laws and you're putting yourself at risk. I think everyone that does that at some level has some form of trauma, because
Mm-hmm.
remember, you're dealing with a job that you're for the most part you're exposing yourself in ways that most people don't understand. Most people might have 8 or 9 critical incidents in their life, life-changing incidents that they see or experience in their whole life, right?
Yeah.
When you're working as a law enforcement officer, you might have hundreds of these, or thousands of these. And my career spans over 30 some years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't even tell you all the people that I've seen victimized and left for dead or dismembered, tortured, children that have been abused, all these things, right? So at some level, everyone that does this is going to have some form of PTSD, right? And I'm not a clinician. I don't understand all the finite
Yeah, me
details
neither.
of it, but there are definitely things that affect you and change your mindset. Now that I've been retired since 2020, I still do consulting work and some other things. I realize just you know just the other day I was going to go in and take a shower and shave and do all those things one morning, and I was like, "Where's my gun?" Like, "Where's my gun?" And
You
I said,
serious?
"I don't need my gun." Yeah, yeah. I was like, I can leave my gun, by the refrigerator. I don't have any children. I live with my wife and I. We're alone and everything. I don't have to worry about kids.
Yeah.
And I actually made a conscious decision to leave my gun there and not bring it with me. So
Huh.
those kinds of things happen all the time. Or I'll go out to a restaurant and my wife will say, "You're going to sit with your back facing the door," and I'm like, I don't do that, right? And she's like, "No, it's therapeutic for you, right?"
Wow.
So those are the things that
Wow.
we do. Yeah, and I do. And for most people, you would not even consider that, right? Like it's not something that you
Yeah.
really think about. But for me, I always had a gun with me everywhere I went. I slept with it. I had it by the shower. I had it in the bathroom. If I went anywhere to the gym to get ice cream, I always had a gun with me, no matter what. And you do that for 30 some years, it's a hard habit to kind of break. And I still carry a gun with me a lot, right? But,
Yeah.
do I really need it if I'm making tea in my kitchen and my gun's in my bedroom? You know what I mean? But that's the
Yeah.
kind of level of thought processes that go through my head. And, I was on another show and we were talking about the fact that I would pull up. I remember I was here in Miami, Florida. I pulled into a grocery store and there was a bag in one of the parking spots, like a brown paper bag that was crumpled up and sitting there. And my first
Yeah.
thought is, that's a bomb. Don't run it over. Park somewhere else. Get away from it. And that's how I think. That's how I think all the time.
Mhm.
Is it a bomb? No, it's not a bomb. It's someone's McDonald's. They just threw out of their car and it's there. But the first thought that and I'm not over exaggerating this. I can guarantee you talk probably 8 out of 10 cops, or mine is a little bit different because I was a police officer several times, right? I was a sheriff deputy, and then I was a state detective, and then I was also a lieutenant for Seminole Indians, which they own Hard Rock International. We did counterterrorism and homeland security stuff for them, right?
Mhm.
So those in and of themselves are different types of positions where you're going to get paranoid, but there's a
Mhm.
healthy balance between being paranoid and actually being alert and ready, right, for your job. But when I was
Mhm.
an agent and when I was operating some austere environments that were very dangerous, environments that had bombings. My car was struck by a brick from a bomb in Bogota, Colombia once, and things like that. So you start developing these things that carry with you because these are the things that keep you alive. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what keeps you alive is being alert and being ready. Not walking around like, oh, is this going to happen? Is this going to happen? You always just have in your mind this kind of dormant state of alert that's ready to kind of pick up motion, and then you react to it in a way that keeps you safe and alive.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I had a former, well, he's still a friend, but cop buddy that he told me, to be a cop is to be a predator, he said. And to catch predators, you have to be a predator. And you have to think like you have to think like them and be like them and almost but not in a bad way. But you have to think how they would think and, you know,
Mm-hmm.
always be on your feet about that.
Yeah,
So that kind of rings true,
yeah.
um, or rings true with what you're saying.
Because you'll
So
see situations where people are killed, or officers are killed, or you might have someone that was killed, shooting events that occur, whatever it might be, and you learn from those events, and those are the things that you carry with you because survival is something in this job that's very real.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so your experience before you went into the DEA, you were in the DEA for, you said, over 30 years.
23 years with DEA. I was with the sheriff's office in Florida near Tampa for about 5.5 years. The Seminole
Okay.
Police, I was a lieutenant over their Homeland Security Detective Bureau for about a year and a couple months, and I was a state detective for about a year and 3 or 4 months as well.
Okay. Yeah. That's a lot. That's a lot. Okay. So over 20 years as a DEA agent, then, and then you said you had a lot of state law enforcement experience. Tell me about the state law enforcement experience. Like, what was it like being um, a state detective, for example? What did you do?
Yeah, so what I when I first began in law enforcement, it was 1989 is when I graduated from police academy.
Mm-hmm.
And all of my instructors were like Vietnam veterans, law enforcement officers with Vietnam veterans. And these guys were hardcore. I was 19 years old, actually 18 when I went in. I graduated. I had just turned 19 a couple months before I graduated. So technically, I wasn't even supposed to be in the class. But because I turned 19 before I graduated, you got to be 19 to be a law enforcement officer in Florida. And those guys, they were teaching us, this is like in the academy, like, okay, you go into a house, you take the guy as a shield, handcuff him, pick him up, use him as a shield, and walk through the house. And if someone shoots, they're going to shoot him instead of you, and then you could draw fire. Lay him down, hide behind him. Things that are totally illegal to do, right? Like,
Yeah.
you have civil rights violations screaming, and these are the things they were actually teaching us in the academy, because it was that era, 1988, 89, and 90. It was a different world, very different world. So as a sheriff deputy, right, I was in patrol. I was in street crimes, which is a surveillance unit, anti-crime, looking for crime before it happens, surveilling people. And I was in SWAT. I did SWAT for about 3 years, and then that's when I got interested in DEA. Went to DEA. Then I got out of DEA. I took a year off, and I got really bored, and I started writing memoir, which I'm still writing. It's done,
Yeah.
but I keep rewriting. And I got bored. So a good friend of mine who was my SWAT sergeant had done a full career at the FBI,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the assistant chief at the Seminole Police. Seminole Police, Seminole Indians own Hard Rock International, so the casinos and all the money that's flowing through the casinos. So I did that with a group of detectives. We had bomb threats, and we did different crowd surveillance operations. We did high end, like Miss Universe pageant was the first operation that I did for protective
That
details.
must have been fun.
That was great. We had like 40 FBI agents there. We had probably 30 detectives there. We had uniform
Yeah.
patrol. It was a really big operation that lasted a week. It was great, and that's the
Oh,
kind of stuff I like doing.
detectives being like bomb sniffers and stuff like that, right?
Well, no, we had the sheriff's office would come in and they would do bomb sweeps for us as training for their canines. It was a great training for them, and they
Hmm.
have a good relationship with the sheriff's office down there in Florida, in Hollywood, Florida. So, and then the FBI brought their SWAT team in, and then we had other FBI guys that were assisting us because it's a big venue, right? Hard Rock is a big venue in Hollywood, Florida, the Guitar
Yeah.
Hotel and so forth. So that was great, and I did that for about a year or so. Then a buddy of mine from the agency, my old partner, he called me. He said, "Listen, I just took a VP job with a company out of Madrid, Spain, and I need a global director, and you're like perfect for this, right? Operation stuff all over the world." So I was like, "Okay, cool. Let me do that. That'll be fun." So I did that for about a year and a couple months,
The
and
agency being the CIA.
yeah, he was with. yeah, Central Intelligence
Okay.
Agency. He was my partner when I was embedded with CIA back in the day when I was in Western Hemisphere, Latin America. So he was the VP and I was his global director, and we knew each other very well because we operated together right downrange. So I did that. That was great. But corporate stuff is can be tricky. I won't get into it, but I could have stayed. I kind of didn't want to. I resigned. A lot of issues. I won't get into all the issues, but I didn't like what I was seeing from the company. And then, I was just kind of like, what am I going to do now? And then I said, I have a state pension from when I was a sheriff deputy. If I do 12 consecutive months, they write me a check. Literally,
Yeah.
like write me a check and give it to me. And I'm like, really? And it's over 100 grand. So I'm like, I'm doing that. Why wouldn't I? So I found this state detective job where we're doing fraud cases, all kinds of fraud and workers' comp and insurance fraud, and things like that. And so I applied, got that job, did that for just over
Hmm.
a year, got the time in that I needed. And I said, yeah, you know what I think I'm going to do? I think I'm going to retire and just do my own thing. A
Yeah.
security thing, consulting thing. I don't talk about some of that, the consulting stuff I could talk about, and I've been doing that ever since for almost a year and maybe 3 or 4 months
Okay. Okay. Um. Well, that's interesting. So in the agency, as you did these global operations, what was your training like?
now. I don't talk about agency stuff. If we're offline, and I might say, well, yeah, I went here, I did this or whatever, but I don't go
Yeah.
into
Yeah. Yeah.
details. Like I don't really discuss anything with the agency because that's not my agency, right? That was me being embedded as a DEA agent with another agency. So I don't
Okay.
really go there. Um, and the agency is not the U.S. government entity you want to piss off, right?
Cross.
So I kind of
Yeah.
stay away. I just stay away from it.
Yeah, those
DEA
guys
training.
are the ones that will send a mosquito drone into your room in the middle of the night.
I don't think they'll send a mosquito drone, but yeah, I just don't want an issue. So I stay away from it all. But
Yeah.
when I went through the DEA Academy, this was in 1998. I was swore in before I went to the academy in 1997 in Tampa, Florida. A guy
Yeah.
named Bob Michelotti swore me in. It was funny because they didn't even take a picture of it or anything. I don't even have like documentation of it. And today you'd probably have a million pictures. It'd be like the Maduro shots with all the DEA guys.
Yeah.
Margaritas on the beach and sun tanning booths and whatever else they did, right? So,
Yeah.
but in this one they didn't have it. And so when I went to the FBI Academy at that time, DEA and FBI shared an academy, right? So you would have
Hmm.
one floor would be FBI, one floor DEA, one floor FBI, one floor DEA, and then we shared the cafeteria, the gym, and everything else. But it was all FBI. We were just visitors in a sense, even though we were allowed there. It was definitely theirs. We were just like the guys that were allowed to be there, right? Because
Yeah.
they were building our academy at that time next door. So, but it wasn't ready yet. So I was one of the last groups. My class was 121, and now I think they're on like 250 or something like that. And
Yeah, yeah. Because I heard I was watching this show called Narcos, and I know Narcos is like the gold standard for, historical accuracy. But but it said that the DEA was like lowest man on the totem pole at one point.
yeah,
Um, and then they kind of rose to more importance,
yeah.
with the war on drugs and all that stuff.
Well, we were tiny.
Um,
We were so small, and what really
yeah.
put us on the map, Nixon created us in the 70s, right? So we were small, super small. But then when Daddy Bush, came into the
Daddy
presidency,
Bush.
Daddy Bush was, affiliated formerly with the CIA, and he loved the DEA. He liked having that kind of like paramilitary international law enforcement element, and he's the one that really pushed us and up into a higher level agency, and we started getting overseas spots. and we started working with crazy stuff. And you hear,
Mm-hmm.
when we did, Panama, Noriega, back in 88, 89, Operation Just Cause, you had DEA guys like meeting submarines off the coast of, Central
Wow.
America. You had, SF guys and DEA guys flying around. You had a real integration of a lot of
SF
stuff.
being
Special Forces, Green Berets, yeah,
okay.
and
Okay.
things like that. So, he's the one that really pushed us into the next stratosphere, and then it just kind of took off to, it kind of went up and down a little bit, over the years with each president and who's who and what's what. But now you can see, with President Trump now his big push, obviously, with DEA.
Yeah. 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 So your training in DEA was with the FBI, and you guys were kind of in the same building. Now, as you moved forward in the DEA, you were in ASAC. You were up in the ranks. What did your training change? Did you have to train again to be an ASAC, or what was that like?
No, so everyone comes in as what they call a BAT, basic special agent trainee, a BAT, and
Okay.
you are treated like a little worm that you are, and you can't use the elevator. So I think I was on the sixth floor of the tower, so we had to go up and down the stairs, like
You
between
serious?
classes and lunch. Yeah, it was just a lot of running, 5 a.m. run, 5 a.m. swim, and shooting, just shooting and shooting and shooting. We shot so much, and I had been on SWAT and street crimes and all that, and I was a really good shot, and I was used to doing tactical shooting. I was used to
Yeah.
all that, and then I carried a Glock when I was a deputy and a Glock in DEA. So everything was really compatible. It wasn't an issue for me whatsoever. But we had some guys they couldn't shoot, and if you fail a qual, you're done. You fail to run, you're done. I mean, I remember our first run. We did a 9 mile run, and it was January. Maybe it was like January 10th or something. Like we're on tank tracks running through Quantico. It's on the Marine Corps base, and we're running, and they didn't allow you to deviate around like big puddles that were all frozen over. So people are running, and the ice is breaking through, and they're cutting their legs and all this stuff, and if you deviated or whatever, they just yell at you, and then you had to write memos, do jumping jacks. It was
Oh
like
no.
it was hardcore stuff. It was pretty hardcore. We're doing calisthenics for an hour in the woods in the snow, and then we run back another 4.5, 5 miles. It was serious stuff. So you had to be in shape. It was,
Yeah.
and you can't fall asleep in class because a couple months in, the training's about 5 months. A couple months in, and you're pretty exhausted because they're really running you and training you, and you're under a lot of stress.
What kinds of stuff are you learning in class, along with all of this physical activity and all that stuff?
Sure. So you get up at 5 a.m. and you might do a swim and then change and do a 4 and 5 mile run. You come in, sit in class, and they're going to have report writing. They're going to have legal. They're going to have international lists. They're going to have a variety of different classes you have to take: undercover, drug recognition, evidence, documentation. Like there's so many different classes you have to take, and you have to learn the statutes under Title 21 or Title 18 or whatever the course dictates at the time, coinciding with your training
Yeah.
placement. So, and you'd be in the class, and by 5 or 6 o'clock at night, you've been up 12, 14 hours, and you've done so much exercising and sitting in a classroom. If you fall asleep, you're done. You're going to be running laps for hours, and so you would have to stand up. They would allow you to stand up, and then you wouldn't be penalized. So just see people standing up all day long, so they wouldn't fall asleep in the class, and they'd be taking notes and so forth. Because if you did, you're writing a
That's
big memo.
insane.
Why you fell asleep and how horrible of a person you are, and you'll never do it again. And then you're gonna do,
Yep.
2 or 3 more miles extra that day. So yeah.
And you had to write these memos in third person. Is that right?
Yeah, you could, I mean, listen, whatever he told you to do, you know, but most of the time it's going to be, Agent Tabor. I never fell asleep, but Agent Tabor, not worthy of being here, fell asleep because of, yeah, yeah, stuff like that. It just depends on what person told you to write the memo,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and then we had, this was 1998. The internet was fairly new, 4 or 5 years new. Think about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? 1995, 96. No cell phones. We had brick phones, right? No one had a brick phone in the academy. We had, I'll set the stage for you. So on your time off, which wasn't much, even on the weekends, we had classes in PT, right? But we had one room that was sunken down like 4 or 5 steps. It would hold about 300 people. And this was the era where Friends was the TV show that was popular at the time,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? So Wednesday night at 8 o'clock at night or whatever, Friends came on. We didn't have cable. This was like showing on air live.
Mm-hmm.
So FBI and DEA guys, we all would go down and watch Friends, and we would have 300 people over. The cabinet TVs that were on the floor that were big squares. That's what we
I
had.
wouldn't know,
Yeah,
but yeah.
Google it. There's big screen TVs back then looked like a big box that was on the floor with wheels, and you would roll it around, and 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 it was heavy. It was like
Wait,
two
yeah,
two
yeah,
feet
yeah.
wide by, you know, 4.5 feet long, and just a big ass TV. And we would all be crowding, all of us FBI and DEA guys, to watch Friends.
I think
And
I,
that
I,
was
I think I remember back when I was out in elementary school, they had those things when they would wheel around the TVs. Man, that just brought that memory back. That's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
Um.
kind of what we did. We didn't have internet. We had no laptops. We had to go to a computer center within the FBI building to get on a computer. Everything was handwritten.
So as you, we are really deviating. Like, listen, guys, I wrote all these questions here, and we're just deviating from them. But whatever, I like it. Um. So as you progress in your law enforcement career, how did you're talking about this computers, and you talk in your book specifically about Bitcoin, and you talk about all these technologies that the criminals are using to evade law enforcement. What are some big ways that you could say that technology transformed the way that you do law enforcement operations from then when you had the big cabinet TVs versus, when you retired in 2020, which is basically super high speed internet, like everything that we have now? How would
It's
you say that it changed everything?
yeah, it's funny. So I reported my first duty station the spring or almost summer of 1998, and I walked into the office, and there was this guy sitting at he had this computer, and it was like a laptop that was like that thick, right?
Yeah.
So thick. And my boss at the time, he's sitting with his feet up on the desk, had suspenders, and he's snapping his suspenders. He goes, hey kid, look at that. And I'm like, look at what? And he's like, that's called a computer. That's the future, kid. What do you think about that?
No
And the
way.
guy
No
opens it, and
way.
he's like, that's what everyone's gonna have one day. I'm like, oh, cool. And then next thing you know, a couple years in, we all got computers on our desks because we had typists. I would dictate reports on a tape recorder or give it to the typist, and she would type up my reports. That's how we did it. All right. So that's how it all worked, even when I was a detective on the sheriff's
Hmm.
office, right? But then it moved into computers, and then it developed into different programs that were in the computers, different
Hmm.
databases, different things that you had to do in training, and all this other stuff. And so, and then when I left from there and I went overseas, my before I had left my first duty station, I did my first wiretaps, and they were on pagers and hard lines. Okay.
Okay.
So I had these drug dealers that were utilizing pagers. So I had 5 or 6 pagers that were called clone pagers. And what I did was I got enough evidence to write up an affidavit, and it's a lot of writing. An affidavit's probably 40, 50-page affidavit of
Oh
evidence
my God, you have to
showing
write
that
those?
they're utilizing pagers, right?
Yeah.
So the judge signs off on it. And now I'm wearing like 5 or 6 pagers on my belt that belong each pager, Pablo, Jose, Alfredo, whatever, and I would
Yeah.
get the page and see what the page was, and then I had figured out what the codes meant, and then I would direct surveillance teams to go out and do surveillance on the people as they were doing their meetings or whatever they were doing based on the codes on the pager, right? So we did that, and then we got enough to where we got a wiretap on a home phone, and they would use the home phone because no one had cell phones back then.
Yeah.
Well, fast forward into, when I went to Guatemala after my first initial duty station, 2004, I went to Guatemala, and they were creating their wiretap laws, and I was helping the Guatemalan government along with a lot of other people to help create the laws so they could do wiretaps on phones, because now we started having cell phones were coming out, right?
Hmm.
So I did that for a year or so, and we were meeting with Supreme Court, justices. We're meeting with justice ministers, all this stuff to kind of mold and assist them in creating all of this legal framework so that they had their constitution in mind, but also law enforcement and judicial process to kind of put it all together to some kind of a semblance of a good legal product and basis for doing wiretaps. And then,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly enough, when I started doing my first wiretaps, I was
Mm-hmm.
using different. We would do spin-offs. Spin-off is someone's doing a wiretap in LA that you get connected to where you're at. So
Yeah.
say you're in Chicago or you're in St. Louis or you're in wherever, and someone says, "Hey, we have a target that's talking to your target. Here's my affidavit. Do a spin-off affidavit on mine." And I did that from a
Hmm.
guy in LA. That guy in LA eventually worked for me in Caracas, Venezuela, years and years later.
So you
But
form these connections that helped you.
that spin-off was actually on. We started doing cell phones and all that stuff, and at that time, LA was like the wiretap. LA and New York were like the wiretap gurus, right? But
Mm-hmm.
fast forward to the end of my career when I was an assistant special agent in charge in LA, you walked into the wire room that used to have 150 people in it, and you might have 4 people because the
Wow.
technology was no longer on cell phones. The technology is now apps that we didn't have access to, different types of communication devices that were not utilized, like specifically by cell phones per se, right? So I'm not going to get into all that stuff, but that's so the technology began, clone pagers, home phones, and then it kind of morphed into other devices, other applications, other things that totally made telephones almost irrelevant.
Wow. Yeah. So that change, it really affected the way technology moves, and that's my sector. For
Mm-hmm.
for anybody who doesn't know, I'm just going to share a little bit about me. That's what I work in, is tech, and I do this podcast as a side project for myself. But anyways, um that is really cool. And one of the questions that I also have for you, finally, I can hit it on a question that I actually wrote down, um, is, again, you were writing in your book about how the criminals use technology, and we've hit on that, but I wanted to hit on it a little bit more. Um, and so these cartels, they also have U.S. citizen operatives on our side of the border that do their bidding for them. For example, they might have, and just feel free to jump in if I'm wrong or anything like that, but
Yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
just what I learned in school. They have legal U.S. citizens go to gun shops, buy 2 or 3 guns, and then ant smuggle them across the border, because you can carry like a gun across the border, and trickle by trickle by trickle by trickle, guns will flow downward from the United States into Mexico to armed criminals, or they find their way into the criminals' hands somehow, some way or another. Um, so are these cartels, are they a big enough threat now to justify a massive change in security like we saw after 9/11? Um, like I saw, a huge. It was like this big. It was this police video, and I remember the guys, they were able to tap into this AI security camera, and I think it was down in Miami or something. But they had this AI security camera. Bam! They identified the guy's face. They knew where he lived. They knew where all of his information just because he had punched a cop, and they were responding to the situation, and they just totally just pulled up an index of the guy. That's I mean, sure he had done something wrong, right? But it feels like privacy advocates would argue that the state has too much power, and then with AI, that's obviously going to be supercharged. Um, as somebody with a lot of law enforcement experience, how do you respond to those concerns that technology in the hands of law enforcement is just going to totally wipe away our privacy?
So I'll give you an example, then I'll kind of backfill it in what I believe, right? So I was part of a meeting toward the end of my career. I won't say where or who was involved, but it was involving uh, a large scale potential surveillance and search warrant application kind of situation. And without getting into any detail, we had many people that were for it, and they said, well, we have a judge that will sign it, and I listened to everyone, and prosecutors were there, agents were there, higher level people, and I came to me and I said, listen, just because you have a judge that's willing to sign it, maybe a hand-picked judge that is pro whatever, doesn't mean we should do it. And I want no part of what this is because I don't think it's going to be constitutional. Am I a lawyer? No. Am I a constitutional specialist? No. But I had been around enough to know that what I was hearing, what I was seeing, I didn't like. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They ended up not doing it, by the way, uh, because of my influence. Who knows? But I looked at everyone in the eye and I said, listen, this is something that I believe we're just doing a circumvention, and it's not going to be true to the spirit of the law. And I think that we are going to be violating constitutional rights if we do this. Even though we'll have a legal authorization, I just don't believe that this is something we should do.
Hmm.
And a couple guys looked at me and they were shocked, and a couple kind of said, you know what? I didn't want to say anything because everyone wants this, but I kind of agree with you. We
Hmm.
would have been legally justified in doing so. Okay, we could have had a judge and authority and all the things that we needed. But what happens is, and I've seen this over my career many, many, many times, is sometimes people get so fixated on getting the end result and winning that they are willing to overlook, or sometimes they're not doing it willingly. They're just kind of in an oversight fashion, they're just missing what they should be doing in the beginning, and that is protecting the rights and security of those citizens of the United States of America, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you absolutely should. So, and whenever I was doing my cases, there were certain criminals that just walked away, even though I probably could have done some kind of enforcement action on them. I just didn't have enough to really secure what I needed to, and I let it go. And it was very hard to do that because it's more important to let someone walk than it is to unjustly charge someone or charge someone
Hmm.
that is not gonna it's not gonna get any traction.
Hmm.
But if we don't have people that are willing to stand up and do the right thing at the highest levels, then we're going to have that vacillation, and that's what's going to hurt us, and that's what's going to create, programs that are damaging to our constitutional rights that we expect to have.
So as a law enforcement officer, then I would, or as somebody with law enforcement experience, I would have to ask, then, um, where do you think the power ultimately comes from? Do you think it comes from the higher ups, the 5 star? My uniform is a disco ball. Um, those kind of generals, or do you think it ultimately comes down to the sense of good and evil within each and every officer in the unit that's actually going to execute the arrest? Like, where do you think the law is drawn, so to speak?
Well, it's multifaceted because when you're dealing with what we have now, where you have a DoD push to do all these counter narcotics cases, right?
Yeah.
That's it's coming from the executive branch, from the president himself, who's signing in designations, right? These are now terrorist organizations, and this is this and this is that. Go forth and do what you have to do. And you have DOJ and State Department lawyers reviewing these things, saying it's okay, right? And if you go back in Bush Jr. W, right, what he was doing, the torture program, right? Black sites, torture program, all this stuff, and that was blessed off as being legal as well. And so you have a myriad of different environmental factors that happen, and stages in time and places and events that occur that will manipulate reaction, right? And
Mm.
you have responses that have to come in a tone and temper that are going to be primarily of protecting the United States of America, but at the same time protecting our rights and what we deserve to have based upon our Constitution and what we expect to have, right? So you have DOD, or the President Executive Branch, and then you might have DOJ and an agent that's on the street that is actually making a determination at that time to take someone's civil rights and, abide by them or violate them. To take
Yeah.
someone's freedom, right? That's done at an agent level. If they do a probable cause arrest, there's no judge, there's no jury there. That comes later. There's no U.S. attorney, there's no state attorney. It's that officer making that judgment on the street. So it goes the whole spectrum. And,
Yeah.
we've always had pushed and really folded into all of our training the importance, and more so now than ever, with case law, what is to be expected, what you can do legally, and so forth. But there's always going to be events that will trigger, like right now, what we have with immigration, for example, right? People are, I sometimes I hear, and there's very mixed opinions out there, but when we had 11 million people come into this country illegally, and you have some people will say, well, they should be able to come here, and what's the problem? They're not committing a crime, and that's all an absolute asinine notion. Uh,
Yeah.
my opinion of that is, you come legally, you do what you need to do. This is not, they said, well,
Yeah. Me too.
1920 we had people coming here by the tens of thousands. Yeah, we did. Okay, but this is not 1920. Now we're in 2025, 26. We have a real terrorism threat. We have a different disease kind of threat that's out there now after COVID, and some of the things we have with measles and so forth. We have the importance of borders are critical. And do we want people coming? Yes. But this is not where we're accepting 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people a year. This is millions of people a year in a very different dynamic environment. And that's the difference.
And it's sad because the illegal immigrants make it harder for the legal immigrants to get in. The illegal immigrants clog the system so much so that the legal immigrants have to wait 5, 6 years, like two, okay, maybe not 5 or 6, but in some cases 5 or 6, like years and years and years and years to get their appointment, even get an interview, even get a chance to come to the U.S. legally.
Yeah,
And so because the system's so clogged with these people who wanted to skip the line,
yeah, yeah. And the
and it's
criminals, the
just it's a
element
bad
is
thing.
fun.
Oh yeah, not to mention the criminals.
And
Yeah.
let me tell you, as someone who's seen the devastation in these Central American and Mexican border towns and so forth. They're kidnapping little kids, organ harvesting, prostitution, forced prostitution and slavery. They're shipping these women in different countries, what they're doing, and robbery and rape and all the things they're doing to little children and women, and torturing men and killing, separating families, enslaving. People don't talk about any of those consequences when they're talking about illegal immigration, and that is a huge issue that the United States of America actually tries to help in these countries, and it's more funding, it's more agents that have to be doing it, and so it's not just within our own country; it's also in other countries that are being severely affected by this immigration push.
Yeah, it's almost like, your book is called, or the subtitle of your book is called Blood Roots and the Rise of Latin American Gangs, and it's almost like those blood roots, those metaphorical veins, so to speak, in the Biden administration became pumped full of blood,
Yeah,
you know, and it's a really dark thing to think about, but um, I just kind of realized that it's probably true.
and that's
Um,
why I wrote it. Infiltrate America: Blood Routes and the Rise of Latin American Gangs. It's more than just Latin American gangs, and I didn't write about every Latin American gang that's out there because I can't. It's not
you
a
wrote about a
comprehensive
you wrote about a
Bible,
crap ton of them.
but I wrote about some of the ones that I felt were of necessity for people that want to know. I didn't write this book to make tons of money. It's not an action adventure book. It's a book. It's an informative book, so people can read it, and a simple understanding and easy flow to the book to realize, like, oh, this is the history of this gang. This is where they are. This is why we have them. This is where they
Yeah.
exist. And then in the case of Tren de Aragua, how do we stop this from gaining root and morphing into a prison gang as well, right? And then have all other peripheral gangs that are morphed from this gang and just create more havoc than we already have. So that's why I wrote the book, because I saw a need for people that wanted to get a good understanding of what was
Hmm.
occurring in the country.
Yeah, and guys, if you're listening to this and you are a trooper that's posted in the Caribbean, you need to read this book like ASAP, because this is like, honestly, if there is a target audience for this book, it's going to be those guys that are in the Caribbean right now that might have to, go into a country or do something in Latin America like right now. It's very educational, but it's really not only for them. As I was reading it, I was thinking about, who could read this. I obviously read it, but anybody, even if you have no experience um with law enforcement at all, if you just want, a deeper insight into what's going on in the news, this book is very it's what I like about it most is that it's very accessible, and it's very simply written, and that it's very clear in what it says about these gangs, and it really just straight up tells you this, gang XYZ does this, and it does it here in this location. And then, it will reiterate its points like again and again. Like one of the greatest points that I got from it was, and it kind of sums up a lot of the book, is where weak states exist, crime flourishes. And it seems like a simple conclusion, but once you read the book, that kind of core message becomes so much more real. And it brings me to another question for you, which is, how does I was reading a book on CJNG, which is a big, I can't say it in Spanish. What is it in Spanish?
Cartel Jalisco Nuevo Generación.
Okay, thank you. Um, they're a big cartel in Mexico. They control, I think, 25 out of Mexico's 32 states. And there's also Tren de Aragua, Um, and they are obviously an international crime gang. So how do these crime groups, how do these cartels grow into such a gigantic, massive, cancerous cell that they could control almost an entire country? How did they get to that level?
Well, let's the two examples you gave, right? So we have Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación (CJNG) in Jalisco, Mexico. They control a large swath of territory in Mexico, but they also are a rival to the Sinaloa cartel, which is kind of a cartel on its knees. It's starting to splinter up, starting to break down. It's really been hammered. They've had a lot of big arrests and cooperators and so forth. So now the CJNG, headed by a guy named Mencho, he is a former police officer, and what he's doing is taking advantage of the Sinaloa cartel being beaten down, and he's trying to be the first and primary narco trafficker in Mexico. And just so you know, the Mexicans control the whole narcotics trade throughout the world, period. Okay?
Really?
Yeah, 100%. They're all over the place, right? But you have this cartel pushing fentanyl, methamphetamine, and all these things, right? So, and that's where over the last decade, between all of the cartels, we've had over 1.3 million people die in the last decade of
Mm-hmm.
of overdose and things like that. And that's not even mentioning the health consequences and what's happening with the breakdown of the family and the fabrics of society is starting to fray and so forth. All these things were occurring because of this, right? Then you have
Yeah.
the Tren de Aragua, which started in Aragua State back in the 90s, early 2000s. And you have Tren de Aragua headed by a guy named Hector Rutherford. And this guy, he started just taking advantage of different social projects because socialism was going to provide all these things for the citizenry of Venezuela, right? So they started a train
Mm.
project for train transportation in the state of Aragua in Venezuela. And what these guys did was tren means train in Spanish. De Aragua means of Aragua. So it was the train of Aragua where they lived, train, right?
Yeah.
And they started stealing, extorting, blackmailing, doing all kinds of things in Aragua when all that money came there for the infrastructure projects. Okay? And then when they started getting into trouble, or the police or the military were doing something, they would go to the politicians and pay off the politicians to keep them clear. And it grew and it grew and it grew to where they covered large amounts of Latin America, from Ecuador to Chile to Panama to whatever, and other parts of Latin America, and including even in Europe, and they just became so lucrative in how they were doing their business that they were paying off more and more politicians, more and more policemen because of the corruption factor and the weak law enforcement and political structures in these countries were permissive enough to where they grew to like they are. Same thing in Mexico with CJ&G, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when they're allowed to flourish, they're going to look to expand. It's just like any other business that you might have. If you're opening up a burger spot and you have one spot and it's just lines around the block, and then a mile away you open another one and it's lines around the block again, you open another one. Next thing you know, you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 McDonald's around the whole country, right? It's the same thing with gangs. And when our borders were basically turned into a porous wasteland, right? Come on in, and we'll give you a cell phone, we'll give you a debit card, we'll put you in an apartment, and we'll feed you. Come
Yeah.
on in, and we're just going to purvey you around the country. And when you get the heat on you in New York, we'll give you a ticket and send you wherever. Oh, you want to go to Aurora? Why do you want to go to Aurora? There's no problem in Aurora, right? Because you heard the mayor.
Exactly.
There's no problem here. And there are people walking around, Tren de Aragua guys posting up with rifles in apartment complexes, right? So they would go there. And it became this almost laughable situation. When I say laughable, it was nothing to do with being funny. It was just laughable that our leaders, that our government were taking such sides on this political angle of, we want to be welcoming to everyone, that they would allow us to become at risk to promulgate that idea. And that's what happened. And that's how they grow. And that's how they did grow. And when Trump came in, he said, we cannot have this gang take a stronghold in our country because we already have enough gangs. And he designated MS-13 as well, if you remember, and
I do.
others, the cartels, as terrorist organizations.
Do you think that's one of the most effective? Do you think Trump designating Tren de Agua and MS-13, as well as these other gangs, international terrorist organizations, do you think that is one of the most effective measures that he's taken against them? And why, if so, do you think that?
So the effective measure comes in the active enforcement and the efficiency of enforcement. The mechanism that triggers that ability to do that aggressive enforcement comes from these designations, law changes, and so forth, right? So when you say this group now is designated, you have a heightened designation of criminal element assigned to it, right? And that's
Yeah.
going to open the aperture of your tools that you have to go after them, okay? And that's
Okay.
when law enforcement can come in and say these are terrorist groups, and they are. I mean, let's be honest. What raping, pillaging, killing, torturing, drug trafficking, extortion, human trafficking, all these things they're doing. That's terrorists do that. It's you just don't blow up buildings and be a terrorist. You could do a myriad of other things and still be a terrorist too. So I
Yeah.
think that designation allowed for that trigger mechanism for enforcement to go in and be much more aggressive, have more tools and funding at its disposal to do what they did, and they did a really good job with Tren de Aragua.
They did. They did. Um, with again with blowing up those boats and well, I don't know if it was
It
Tren de
was.
Agua on the
It
okay
was
it
Tren de
was
Aragua working with Nicolásito, Celia Flores, and Nicolásito was the interface with Hector Rutherford in Caracas, Venezuela, that was ordering. He's the founder of Tren de Aragua, ordering those guys to move those
Nicolásito
drugs.
being Nicolas Maduro's
Nicolas
son.
Maduro's son, who's now indicted.
That's
Now,
cool.
this information is coming from sources that I have that aren't when I was with the government. I'm speaking of what I know now because I have a lot of sources in different parts of the world, but Venezuela is kind of a specialty for me, and that's how I know what's going on in Venezuela.
Yeah,
And you can see through the indictments. If you read the indictments, there's a reason why they indicted those Hector Rutherford and they indicted who's Nicolásito.
yeah. So let's touch briefly on Venezuela before we wrap up here. I think if you'll be on again, I think I'm gonna have to have you on for a second podcast just to cover everything that I want to cover. Um, but let's talk a little bit about Venezuela before we wrap up again because we're going on an hour here.
Sure.
So the current situation in Venezuela, you have a vice president who ascended into power. Um, her name is Delcy Rodriguez, right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. What can you tell me about her?
So Delcy Rodriguez, I call her Miss Feckless. Okay.
Yes.
She has a good power base under Nicolas Maduro, but she was also there with Nicolas Maduro because she would do what Nicolas Maduro wanted to do. And when we talk about Venezuela, we have to talk about its slide backwards. I mean, 1950s, it was one of the richest countries in the world, very modern, very close ally to the United States. 1992, the coup attempt where Hugo Chavez, the former president, had attempted to take over the country. He was imprisoned. They let him out and pardoned him a few years later, which he eventually then became president by election. He
Yeah.
got into place and he said, we're going to be the socialist revolution. And they were all calling themselves Chavistas. Okay.
Mm.
So what happened was their notion of being a Chavista was socialism, which really ends up being communism, Marxism, right? And
Yeah.
and they're promising all these things. The next thing you know, well, we promised you, but you're not getting that. And by the way, we're taking your family's 500-acre farm. So get the hell out of here, right? And
Yeah.
then you
It
had
turns
8
into
million
a
people.
dictatorship.
Yeah, it was a pure dictatorship. 8 million people left Venezuela, 30 million stayed. Most of the talent, most of the educated, most of the people with money all fled to preserve what they had in different countries, right? And then
Yeah.
you had the Cartel de los Soles, which then was created. And we're not talking about like a hierarchy kind of structured cartel where you have Chapo Guzman and then you have this, then that, the plaza bosses, the runners, and all these things. You have an informal cartel of individuals, and this was their countrymen were calling this the Cartel de los Soles because the generals were stars instead of they were suns on their applet, right, instead of stars.
Really?
And soles
Really?
means suns. So you have these generals that had the suns, and they call it Cartel de los Soles, the cartel of the suns. Okay.
Huh. Yeah.
So what happened was that formed into where you had now you had colonels and light colonels and captains, and then you had people, commissarios in the police force, intelligence elements. They were all helping narco traffickers that were coming from Colombia, the FARC, ELN, and so forth. All these different narco trafficking organizations, terrorist groups that kidnap and kill and bomb and do all the things in Colombia. They were utilizing Venezuela to move drugs to Europe and the United States. Okay?
Hmm.
And then that grew into other narco organizations, Medellin Cartel, Cali Cartel, and so forth. All the guys like Steve Murphy, Javier Pena that worked Pablo Escobar. Then you have Cali Cartel with Dave Mitchell and Chris Feistel.
Yeah.
And
I
a
know
lot
them.
of
Yeah.
their guys fled to Venezuela to hide. And all they had to do was fork over $1,000, $2,000 a month, and they were safe in Venezuela. So
That's
you have them
crazy.
harboring fugitives, you have them harboring people that were hiding, you have them harboring terrorists, and then begins where you have bad actor states like Iran, Cuba, China, and they started building and creating elements within Venezuela, military, intelligence, and so forth, because they are sworn enemies of the United States, right? And how do you get close to the United States? You have to have it's good to have a proximity to the United States. It's good to come into a country and get a new backstopped identity, pay $5,000 and you get your birth certificate, school certificates, everything you need to start a whole new life under a new name. So you might come from, say you're coming from Saudi Arabia and you're part or Iraq and you're part of a Ba'athist movement and you're a terrorist and you come to Venezuela and then you say I want to be named, Joe Frank Moses, and
You're
I want to
speaking from
be
actual
born in
experience here,
Valencia.
aren't you?
I'm sorry?
You're speaking from experience here, aren't you? You saw some of these
Absolutely, I am.
guys. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. Right? So then you have terrorists that are developing new identities that can
Mm-hmm.
come to different countries because the passport, Venezuelan passport, was valuable back in the 90s and 2000s when Chavez took full reign in 2003. And then people started seeing what was happening there. It changed. Everything changed, and the passport started having an erosion of value to where it is today, where it's worthless, right? But they took full advantage at that time. You have Hezbollah was, known to be training in Margarita Island. Money was a safe haven in Venezuela, and toward the end of all this, you have non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah. You have narco trafficker terrorist organizations like FARC and ELN in Venezuela. And then you have all the countries like Iran with drone factories in Venezuela. You
Oh
have
yeah.
Syrians coming over, freedom fighters to come fight the gringos when we are going to invade. So we had a whole myriad infused full of bad actor people that wanted to kill Americans in Venezuela. This was much more than just the Tren de Aragua moving dope for the traffickers on the coast. It was much more than that.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's a good dose of information about Venezuela. I wish we had more time because I would ask you about Diosdado Cabello and how he controls the colectivos and
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff. Maybe we could talk about that another time.
Sure.
But it was really nice having you on the show, everyone. Again, as I've mentioned again and again, please buy this man's book. It is amazing. Um, Anything else you want to say to the audience regarding your time in Venezuela or regarding, just what's going on in the news lately? Like, should you trust what you see, or is there a lot more happening than we know about? Like, is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, there is. So, you see the photos and videos of Maduro coming in, and all the guys, grabbing him, taking all these photos, and him going to court, and you know, things like this don't happen by one or two people. This takes teams and teams of people over many, many years to develop and work these cases. We have people that were informants in different countries that were trying to do the right thing to save their country who lost their lives in this effort.
Hmm.
We have people that have been threatened to be killed. They had to flee, they had to run, they had to hide. And I'm one of them at one point, right? So you have a lot of people who have made a lot of sacrifices over a lot of time and put everything on the line to make these things happen and to change what was going on in the Western Hemisphere, because what we were looking at was something very daunting. This is not something just about the oil. The oil is something that's going to be used to rebuild that country and to pay for the effort to take the country back.
Hmm.
Okay, it's not the cause for what we wanted to do, and I talked about that somewhat. We can talk about it next time if I'm on. If you'll have me on again, I can definitely
Yeah.
detail that more. But you
Yeah,
know,
I'll have you on again.
there's no one person or one group. This was a total effort by many people in the U.S. government, people from other governments that
Yeah.
sacrificed a lot of things for this to happen, and a lot of people lost their lives in this. And
Yeah.
I want them to understand that. So, when you're watching the news and you're reading all these things, these sacrifices are at a cost to people and their lives and their families. And that's something that people have to really understand and appreciate. And sometimes, we lose that fact because people say, oh, no, these people, they just care about themselves. And that's just not the case. Most people get into this line of work to do a good thing for their country, and they sacrifice their whole lives, and it changes them, who they are and who their families are and how they live.
Hmm.
And it's very important that they realize that.
Everybody, you know, some people want. It seems like some people want their 5 seconds of fame, but others live with a lifetime of uh, of real hurt, or sometimes not a life at all, just so these things can happen, and just so the interests of our country and not just our country, but that liberty can be advanced
Mm-hmm.
forward in the world. And it's very profound what you just said. I really like that.
Good.
I really like that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your perspective. I know you're an expert in a lot of things, so maybe we can do another podcast sometime in the future.
You bet.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening to what will hopefully be my first episode with West Tabor. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, then please follow the podcast on Instagram. It's linked in the podcast description. Please rate the podcast 5 stars on Spotify and give it a good review on Apple Podcasts as well. Tell a friend or family member about it. That really helps the show grow. And as always, have a more perfect day.